So we decided to bring the veterans together, the Obama administration and others, and then our Copenhagen climate negotiations there, I met this gentleman named Dominic. And he had been busily working to organize 1,000 elected officials in New York to Democratic. And they had to chat and said, hey, we should bring the local electeds and the state electeds and some federal electeds together and form elected officials to protect them. Since then, we now have 3 major programs. We will get into those so we can introduce them. We can think of EOPA working in 3 areas. The first one is focused on education. So we have a partnership with the University of San Francisco, where we have a certificate in public leadership and a master's degree in public leadership. For military veterans and families, the master's degree is completely covered. We truly believe that we have to get service. We should not be waiting for the national service. And then for the certificate in public leadership, we bring elected officials from across the world, investors, journalists, and climate leaders together in Washington, D.C. for a weekend that sits on the modules. We learn about public
I will teach you after now. I'll teach you after this session.
Disinformation and cybersecurity, climate leaders and solutions. And it's really a wonderful program for me. You're there to us, and network and learn from so that's the education side. On the media side, the reality is lawmakers don't necessarily read a lot of white papers. They're piled up on my desk. But if you put us in a video and then we show our friends, this information is disseminated. So we have a media arm where Anna Day is the award-winning journalist. We have the award-winning prize. It's only talented. She heads up our video production side. And we make short videos highlighting the important climate solutions. We have a podcast that goes out to 25,000 elected officials, and a news magazine is also releasing. The podcast is called City Climate Park.
Yesterday was working
And our
fine.
parent organization, the Solon Center for Research
I
and Public
changed the inputs because I wasn't getting any
published books
inputs.
on
So the camera just did something. But before it used to be directly
And then,
from
it's
my
probably
microphone.
much in many ways, is the policy and advocacy. And that ranges on
So you know what topic? I've talked to Ahmed because Ahmed's 50 years old.
talking about a little bit. And then the domestic side, implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is wonderfully massive undertaking. We got to implement it correctly so that we get the vaccine. Offshore wind is a big program that we still exist. The potential there is unbelievably amazing. Despite some of the challenges, it's still one technology that will revolutionize clean energy on the coast. And we can learn a lot from the world in this one. Awesome, be a leader actually. And then when we come to the state-based programming, we have environmental justice focused programs. So in California, setbacks from oil wells, safety buffers essentially. Same thing in New Mexico. And then New Jersey and New York and other states, we have state-based programming, which really environmental justice focused.
I am also a former employee of the second largest refinery in the country in Beaumont, 15 miles to our north. And the industry began, as America knows it, in Jefferson County, Texas, in the vicinity of Beaumont and Port Arthur. So we understand fully what's going on and what's involved here with that. But with all that the petrochemical age has brought to America as well as the world, there's a darker side we fail to talk about. And that is the side of, as you mentioned, environmental justice. What has happened to communities of color and the people of color in these cities? They have simply not been able to keep up and have not been given their proper due. And why I say that is because we have some of the highest cancer rates in the country, statewide as well as nationally. We have high rates of COPD, lung and kidney disease. And this is a byproduct from the environmental industrial pollution brought on by petrochemicals. So as I think you and I were talking about earlier, what does environmental justice and a just transition look like for communities like mine? Well, first of all, we've got to make sure that the air is clean, because we need air more so than we need water or even food. All you got to do is just stop breathing for a minute and see just how long it's going to take you before you have to take that next breath. You'll find out real quick. So we first have to give people back their God-given right to clean, non-toxic air, because air is life. And then we have to create opportunities as we go about this transition to help those communities like mine, Freeport, Texas, Lake Charles, Louisiana, and all up and down the Gulf South in America, to help them be a part of this transition so that they are no longer left behind, nor are they polluted in the same way or even at all as they were in the age of petrochemicals and fossil fuels. And that's what it looks like to me, is creating those opportunities for a just transition, a better life, and to make sure that this is a full and complete conversion out of fossil fuels so that we can live better, because as we go, so goes the whole planet. That pollution and contamination from fossil fuels, as we're exporting more and more through places like mine, is going to affect the rest of the planet. And soon they will be at the nexus of climate change, being at the forefront of all of this and seeing the negative effects. So while there's yet time, let us act squarely and decisively to make sure that this energy transition saves the planet, saves the health and lives of people, and make sure that no one is left behind.
Thank you, John. Eugenia, would love to hear your perspective and how you got plugged into the work of an energy transition in Ukraine.
Well, the story can be very long, but I will try to do all my best to cut it short. But before, thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure and honor, and to be the voice of Ukraine, because while the COP is going on, and the world leaders and activists and like different actors are trying to advocate for the green transition, and that is so much important for the world to have this 1.5 limit degrees. For Ukraine, 1.5, it's not a number. 1.5, this is a matter of survival. So 1.5 is much more than just something that you can get on the scale. The point that Ukraine has become the forefront of something that we can call the shift of geopolitical order. We can call it like we can call it just like the Russian invasion, but it's much more than that. It's the war, and it's not only the war between we know who actors are there. It's much bigger, and one of the reasons of that is our over-reliance on the fossil fuels. It's our denial of the fact that the world has been dependent on so many things. And this is like the geopolitical shift which now is going on, at the total reflection of the world that has been for too long time denying the fact that we are over-reliant on the fossil fuels. And Ukraine is there on the forefront. So for Ukraine, when we'll be talking about the green transition and clean transition, first of all, we are there the victims, but we are there to give the solution. And the Marshall Plan that has been recently announced, like to support Ukraine, that kind of like copy pasting something that we already know in the 40s, like to help the Germans post-war economy survive and actually showcase the whole world how the green transition can be like fully applied in Ukraine. Because for Ukraine, the transition, the clean transition, it's also the matter of survival and the matter of leapfrogging. And moreover, it's a great chance to show the whole world how the country in war, the country in conflict, actually can ensure the green transition to happen even faster than those countries that don't have the war. And interestingly, there are like always there is a silver lining when the huge crisis comes. It does mobilize the society, right? And it showcased in Ukraine that with the help, of course, of international partners, with the help of like such great initiatives, one of these is the like Marshall Plan, but it showcased that Ukrainian people are so much willing to drive the transition just and green. Ukrainian people, Ukrainian government showed how much they are devoted to fast transformations. And during the period of like ongoing conflict, like ongoing war, it's not the conflict, it's the war, we have already deployed like the wind farm. And other countries couldn't do that. I wouldn't name these countries, but we did it like since the full Russian scale invasion. So we ramping up renewables while the war is going on, and we are very much unique case. So that's why I think the implications of like with not maybe it's about not about the implications, but using Ukraine as a showcase, it can ensure and show to the whole world how green and just transition can happen almost overnight. Of course not, but for a short period of time, it's something very unique. And we are really much grateful, Ukraine, to all of the international partners and collaborators who are there for us to help, who help us to stand, because now Ukraine is just going back like further and further from the news, from the world's agenda. But we are there, we are fighting, we are struggling, and we really need such a great help and support that countries around the world are providing to us. And we really are there to show that with your help, we can teach the world how to do it better and how to ensure that the energy transition is very important, that the energy transition is not only the matter of abstract things, it's a matter of life and death. And this is where like Ukraine is there to show that there is always life, there is always hope. Please do stand with us, and we will teach the whole world how we can do it the best.
Thank you, Eugenia. And I think your comments were, first of all, thank you for your incredible experience, and we know it's heart-wrenching to have your country go through what it's going through. And I really appreciate what you talked about. This is also, as tragic as it is, and unjust as it is, an opportunity for a just transition. And I think, John, that ties to your point as well, in what you're experiencing in Texas. And we've been, as Alex mentioned, working on this issue in California a lot. What does it mean for oil and gas drilling, where, unlike Texas, there are no setbacks from oil and gas wells? They have toxic oil wells, literally feet from people's homes, schools, hospitals. And so we've been working on that for years in California for a just transition and phase out of fossil fuels. Alex, I'm curious, how did EOPA start working on the Ukraine Energy Security Marshall Plan?
Thank you. So our work with Ukraine started in many ways because of my time in Afghanistan. When I was deployed out there, I used to run with the Afghan women athletes for their protection. And then I also worked with female journalists who were literally putting their life on the line. And these ladies are much more courageous than a lot of us in the military, because the air quality there is also extremely poor, in addition to the security concerns. And unfortunately, when the time was for us to leave, they didn't have any documents that directly tied them to working for the US government. And because of those documents weren't there, we were going to leave them behind. The Taliban went to one of their houses, beat one of them up sadly, and took their running shoes. And I was like, we've got to find a way to get them to safety. And so I called one of my friends up from NATO school, and she's Ukrainian, Irina Androk, former lieutenant colonel. She has 4 presidential awards from 2 different presidents in Ukraine. Really inspiring lady. And she said, well, let me see if I can get my general, who's now the equivalent of the CIA director for Ukraine, to send an airplane. And they did. She was asked to go on that plane with her special forces. We went there, many sleepless nights, and she evacuated over 400 people, including all the Afghan women athletes. I was almost killed in the mission. Her special forces saved her. Zelensky gave her a Medal of Courage for it. The only woman to ever get this medal, and only about 320 have it. She's truly inspiring. And we were able to get the folks we worked with to safety, and eventually over 4,000 others. And we brought, most of them ended up coming to Ukraine, and sadly we had to do another evacuation and get her family and others out of Ukraine for their safety. Which really does underscore the dangers of being reliant on a single source of energy. And so from there, we were like, how can we continue to help Ukraine? And it became very apparent that we needed an energy security Marshall Plan to help Ukraine become energy independent from the ties of oil and gas, because that is what's holding their security concern. It's a serious security concern, because you can take one missile or drone and take out a coal or gas power plant, and it takes months to years to rebuild it. If one of their solar plants got hit, 2 days later it was up and running again. The wind turbines, they're basically like pencils that are really far apart. It's extremely hard to hit them, and you need a ballistic missile to take one out, really. And that's extremely expensive, and it's very not economical to take out 19 or 18 wind turbines that are up and running right now, which, even more courageous, they built it in a combat zone, and a good chunk of the time the workers were in bunkers. So that this is inspiring to see. If Ukraine can build wind turbines in combat areas, the rest of the world can deploy this quickly. It's not a technology issue. It's a, hey, do we have the will to do it? And do we have the political policies in place to make it happen with the public-private partnerships? So the Energy Security Marshall Plan for us takes 3 different levels. One on a very person-to-person, local-to-local, is bringing solar panels in to power hospitals so that people don't freeze and the essential equipment is there. Partnered with Repair Together, where they bring youth to rebuild while playing music and others. It's been inspiring to see some of the stories they've been doing to help the country on the front lines. But also on the government-to-government and state-to-state. So bringing our mayors and connecting them with other mayors across the U.S. and the UK to make sister city partnerships and sister state partnerships. And that's not hard for us to do. We work with elected officials across the U.S. and parts of the UK and other places, and a lot of the mayors want to help and provide the technical assistance and do fundraising in very specific ways we can help with building that relationship with the cities. But the real impact at large scale is going to need capital, right? So we will need legislation in Congress, we'll need it in Parliament, and it's not just, hey, we need the $230 billion to make the energy sector more secure in Ukraine. It's the insurance, so we can make sure that the companies coming in have that confidence to rebuild right now, right? They're really good at protecting the assets, but we need that confidence to build the investment in, because we can't wait. If we wait now, literally people will freeze to death, sadly. We have people in high rises who are disabled, and they can't get down in the elevator when the power goes out. 50% of the infrastructure was destroyed in Ukraine, and people were without power and heat and water for an average of 5 weeks last winter. So this is a real human impact that we need to have the solution to. But the amazing thing is, distributed clean energy is so much more secure because, as we were saying before, they can try to take out some solar panels, they'll pop right back up, right? You can fix it easily, and in more innovative ways, there are basically electric vehicle charging stations which take up spot of a parking spot to 3, and it can be on the grid and off the grid, and charging minivans or buses, which then you plug it into the hospital when it needs the power, because it's a giant battery basically on wheels, or you take it to the command center where they need to run the operations for the warfighting. So there are many applications that actually make us more secure, but also a better warfighter. So energy security is not just about the environment, it's about ensuring that democracy exists and that we are protecting it. And we can do that, and Ukraine is leading the way with innovative examples. And so we appreciate the support that's coming from around the world and the US as we move an energy security Marshall Plan forward. So.
Thank you, Alex. I think you brought in the global perspective and why that's so important for energy security, democracy, our environment, and we've seen here at COP just how the conversation with fossil fuels has really come on the global stage, and people being aware of the need for a fossil fuel phase out for all sorts of reasons, including global security and environmental justice and climate justice. John, we've, as you know, Elected Officials to Protect America has a letter going of more than 1,100 elected officials from 47 states calling for a federal climate emergency plan and declaration to phase out fossil fuels in the United States. You've lived it in Port Arthur. Alex mentioned the human experience. What's that human experience been, and what does a just transition and a fossil fuel phase out look like in a refinery community like yours?
Well, Dominic, a fossil fuel phase out for a community like mine, many would probably feel it's a threat because we're heavily based on fossil fuels and petrochemicals. But once again, as I said earlier, we have to look at the effect it's having on the lives and health of people in the community. And when you and the other gentlemen were mentioning, talking about the fact of how you have to have distributed power sources to do that, when we look at the climatological aspects, Port Arthur has been hit since 2017 by 5 major hurricanes. There's still a number of homes that are substandard, that are still suffering from the devastating effects. And the dependence on the energy grid is really a critical issue. But by diversifying your energy sources, you not only create greater efficiencies for those people, because a lot of the people in my hometown, 2/3 are economically disadvantaged out of 57,000. So now you're enabling them to save money. And then you work toward energy efficiency by making the homes warmer in winter, cooler in the summer. So that is one of the effects that would come from an energy transition that has an environmental justice component dealing with climate and climate change. We're getting out of fossil fuels, which is a main driver of climate change, while transitioning over to cleaner forms of renewable energy that is going to enable people to live better because they don't pollute the air, and they also are more efficient in terms of helping them save money. So when we talk about that, that's the thing that sticks out most in my mind about an energy transition. How can we use the IRA and other aspects that are there to make that possible? But then again, you still have the specter of getting out of fossil fuels, of getting out of exports of LNG and crude oil. And we have to stop doing that because we're spreading that black death, that fracked gas, to other nations, and we're enabling the endangerment of those peoples too. I've talked to some of my colleagues in Europe, and they look at the gas as being freedom gas because it's not coming, unfortunately, through Ukraine from Russia and all of that, those sources that they consider not to be as dependable. But what I tell them is that freedom isn't necessarily free. It's paid for with a price, and that gas is paid for at a price from the wellhead out in West Texas, crossing over the ancestral and territorial lands of numerous indigenous tribes, and then coming down to the Gulf Coast and affecting cities and communities because they're not built in affluent areas. They're not built in River Oaks in Houston or Highland Park in Dallas or any of those affluent areas. They're built in poorer communities because, as one of the officials said, those people have less of an ability to fight back. They can't afford lawyers. They can't afford the people to be represented. Most of them don't even understand what this energy transition and all that's going on is about. So they can, not observe zoning rules, as you said earlier. They can put them next door to you and next door to schools and endanger lives and health. but an energy transition for Port Arthur and of all the Gulf South is one where we get away from those sources of energy, doing exactly what you said, calling for a climate emergency and calling for a ban on those exports and a ramping down or phasing down and eventually phasing out before 2030 of those exports and all of those causes and the emissions that exacerbate and drive climate change. So that's what an energy transition would look like for us, and we have to do this. We have to disassemble that which has been put together, but at the same time replace it with clean, green renewables, or as I like to say, instead of investing your money in fossil fuels, reinvest it in the communities of color and into renewable energy. Matter of fact, don't just add the same money, double or even triple it. We just heard about Russia, was it Russia? Two of the other nations, China and India, talking about doubling down on coal, and so many other nations doubling down and doing more in nuclear. But those have problems too and are extremely problematic for communities. Where are you going to put the nuclear waste? Their waste is going to be there. What are you going to do with it and handle it? We're already not doing that in the States. And then what about, coal? We know the harmful effects of it. And you can't science your way out of it. I like what my indigenous brothers say. It's buried in the ground for a reason. Keep it in the ground. We have enough above ground that we can use. Abundant sunshine, geothermal, other sources that we can use that are more reliable, and we can science our way to using that and accelerate the transition. So I'm all in favor of what you and your organization is doing in that regard. And elected officials have to be the drivers behind it and understand it so that individual cities, county governments, and even states can make this transition and make it fair, just, and equitable.
Amazing. I would vote for you. I think you brought in a really important point that in this time where we need to be phasing down fossil fuels and phasing out fossil fuels, we are seeing an expansion of some fossil fuel infrastructure around the world, including with LNG, liquid natural gas, in the United States. Eugenia, I'm curious from your perspective, from Ukraine, given the experience of Ukraine, what does energy security, what does climate justice look like in the face of that kind of fossil fuel expansion? And how can Ukraine be a model for the world in a phase out and transition to clean energy?
First of all, I would like to note that in Glasgow 2026 Glasgow, when the countries around the world did pledge to phase out coal, Ukraine was one of those countries. And despite all of the prognosis that, due to ongoing war in Ukraine, we will not be able to do that, we did pledge it this year one more time. We will phase out coal by 2030. So we will do that. And if we can, isn't it the great case how the world should do? But coming back to maybe precisely to your question, how Ukraine can teach the world what climate justice and what the green transition is. First of all, Ukraine can show the world what is the result of climate injustice and lagging behind meeting the goals of the transition. So Ukraine is the great showcase that the country in the middle of Europe, I would continue this message, right? That we are suffering from the ignorance and arrogance of the countries that were not willing to look up. And this is the point number one. The second point, Ukraine, of course, will definitely show how fast and effective we can be in ensuring this kind of transition. Because according to the energy strategy of Ukraine by 2050, we are reaching net zero, and we will do that. I'm sure that we will be able to do that. Of course, maybe there would be a little bit of the leeways, but according to this strategy, we are ensuring the decentralization of the system. We are ensuring the ramping up of solar, wind. We are open, and we have all of the technical feasibility for the introduction of the hydrogen, and we have the numerous of projects that have already been launched to support this kind of transformation in Ukraine. But of course, there could be different talks that without the finances we can't do that. Yes, definitely. This is why we need help. We can't do it fully without the international expertise, that's absolutely for sure. But what Ukraine should and can show the world, our willingness to change. We are ready to change, and we have already started. And actually, we have started developing the recovery plans, I think, after a week of the full Russian scale invasion, because we did understand that if we don't start today, because the time is now, and this is all about COP, right? The time is now. We don't have time. We don't have time to think about when war finishes, but when would be the point to start the recovery and reconstruction. That's why this topic very much, inspired me and like gave me the whole like point and the mission, like the previous days. It's just because you see the silver lining, right? Because we have to act now, and we have to develop the comprehensive plans that would align with the international standards, with European standards, according to which Ukraine, by aligning with them and implemented in our legislation, that we would fully ensure that the green transition is there and that our system is there ready to do it fast. Of course, we have like lots of things to be done with the support of the European Union, and that we have been granted the European Union candidate status. And on the one hand, like some people would say that this is our obligations. No, it's our willingness, and we did pledge like to do this much before, longer before, like official like accreditation started to happen. So coming back to the point, Ukraine can show the world, first of all, that we are there acting already now amid the ongoing crisis. And if we can do it, the whole world can do it, should do it, must do it. The second point is that we are showcasing that the best innovative technologies can be deployed, and we're creating the environment for the investors to trust us. We really do all of our best. Of course, we have some disadvantages these days. Of course, there are lots of like the long path to do that. We need to we need fully to ensure the liberalization of the market. Really, it is like pretty much like these days a little bit manipulated, but anyway, we are there on our path, and we can show other countries, especially it could be very much appealing to those countries that are in the war-afflicted areas or in the conflict areas, that there is the chance to rebuild, and like actually the rebuilding and recovery is happening already now. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you, Evgenia. And I think you hit the nail on the head, so to speak, of saying how Ukraine really can be a model, and if there was ever an example in the history of Earth of how the fights to protect democracy, to protect people, to protect our planet are interlinked, it's how for global security and for human security we need to phase out fossil fuels. And as you eloquently said, if Ukraine can do it, anyone can. It's not a technical problem, right? You've shown that it's technically feasible to do even in a war zone to get these clean energy deployed, and more importantly, that the political will, and that's really what is needed. And I think that is a great way to close us out here in this conversation. And one last question for you, Alex, as we move forward. What's next for EOPA and is on the horizon?
Well, we'd invite everyone to join us at our Certificate in Public Leadership. The next cohort will be August 9 in Washington, D.C. And then we will have our Energy Security Summit at the Department of Energy again. But also just rounding out and saying how we really appreciate Globe and the partnership here we have to meet amazing elected officials from around the world who have a shared mission here of making our planet more secure with a just transition to phase out fossil fuels to ensure we have the security in Ukraine and all over the world, because this is globally connected. What's happening, unfortunately, is you have a cartel that controls all the oil and gas, basically. And it's autocratic nations on OPEC. OPEC Plus is a bit of more mix, but essentially, the autocratic nations have a disproportionate control and influence over what's happening in many nations. And one of the best things we can do for our democracy worldwide is diversify in clean energy. So it's making us more secure, it's making us much more health, and it's ensuring that we have economic prosperity into the future. So thank you again, Globe, for hosting us. We really appreciate the partnership and the connections we have with the amazing lawmakers from across the world dedicated to solving the climate crisis.
Thank you, everyone.
So I think we can take a few minutes to have a Q&A session with you. We do have another session in half an hour, but I think the content that you've shared is just so fascinating. I'm sure that there are questions. I certainly have some questions. First of all, really interesting the work that you're doing domestically in the US. And especially what you said about the way in which you are translating the measures in the Inflation Reduction Act at a state level and at a local council level. So would love to hear more about that, because ever since last year, with the Egyptian COP, there's been much greater emphasis on the need for this multi-level governance agenda. So there's not just the expectation that the federal government adopts a set of policies and it then delivers, but then on the cascade through the different levels of government. So that's on one side. On Ukraine, Evgenia, you'll be pleased to know that last year at COP, we worked closely with the Verkhovna Rada and with Yulia Ovchinnikova and the Committee on Environment. And actually, she foregrounded the issues around environmental protection and the unique place of ecocide in environmental legislation in Ukraine. So we are pleased to provide a platform for that. But we have heard a great deal in the last few days about the challenge that countries who are dependent on a fossil fuel economy have in making that green just transition. So a few days ago, we had members of parliament from South Africa. We were having a very similar conversation about what does it take to take communities who are entirely dependent on coal mines. And the South African government has now committed to phasing out up to 12 coal mines. What does it take to get those communities back on their feet? So that there are health implications, but there are also the very basic economic dilemmas where you've got members of the household who are bringing in the money from coal. Do you need a worker's guarantee? What kind of provisions do you need? But of course, it's not just South Africa. And this is where I'm interested in. And this is a kind of proposal for us to think innovatively. Just like you're working on a Green Marshall Plan for Ukraine, there is the international partnership called JETP, which is the Just Energy Transition Partnership with South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, and I've forgotten the fourth one. But those 4 countries are receiving support from the United States, from the UK, from other countries to facilitate that transition. Why don't we have a Ukraine part of that conversation? Because we have this artificial divide between the East, the West, and we hardly ever get to talk about what's happening in Central Europe, the Stans, Eastern Europe. So can your work inspire cooperation on that front? Because these are all shared dilemmas. So just some thoughts to get your responses on, please.
Great. So we'll start out with the Inflation Reduction Act. And the question you had was focusing on the implementation of that within the states. Because the reality is, it's the first step is to get the legislation passed. But the implementation is unbelievably important of how well we do it. Because if we don't implement the Inflation Reduction Act effectively, we're not going to get to the 40 to 43% reduction in carbon pollution by 2030 that it can provide. And that's really important because the U.S. is the second largest polluter in the world when it comes to carbon emissions. But just as importantly is how do we do that while hitting the Justice 40 marks that are in the legislation to ensure that communities and 40% of the investment, at least 40%, gets to communities like yours. So the way to do that is educating the elected officials to know here are all the different programs, because the reality is, unless you've been a municipality, a city, or a state who's been actively engaging in the federal government, you're not going to know about the multitude of funding opportunities, because $369 billion that can be leveraged up to $2 trillion with private capital is actually, it's hard to deploy that in a short amount of time effectively. And we need to let lawmakers know, hey, here are the opportunities, here's the criteria, and then here's the technical assistance of how to apply. Because you can't expect a smaller municipality or a state who hasn't done a lot of this work before to be able to just upend and negotiate the complex processes of a federal grant. And unlike the investments we had under the Obama administration, where cities were literally hiring people in anticipation for that legislation to be passed, this caught everyone off guard when it passed. So even larger cities weren't ready for the capacity to bring and distribute the funds. The great news is the Biden administration is working really hard to partner with NGOs like ours to be able to bring the knowledge down to the elected officials, who then can disseminate it to the communities and fellow elected officials. So it's a lot of work to do because there's a tremendous amount of capital, but it's also unbelievably inspiring to see a place in Newark, New Jersey get funding for the first time to do job training for offshore wind. That's never happened there, right? And these are opportunities that have tangible jobs waiting for them that are well paid, and they're family sustaining jobs. And so the long way to say, it's working with the lawmakers to make sure we're educating them. It's working with the NGOs like ours and others to facilitate that, and then providing that technical assistance to be able to understand the criteria and apply, and then distribute the funds effectively into communities. Because in the council, it can be 3-4 removed for that federal funding's coming, right? And then being able to understand how to bring that in. I don't know if you want to add to that, or we can jump to the next question.
Yeah, it's crucially important that people understand with the IRA that it is a whole of government approach. And in terms of the jobs and creation and the transition from a coal type economy to that, you have to have, first of all, you got to have the grassroots effort. You mentioned NGOs, but you also have to have the CBOs, the community-based organizations that have their hands and roots in the community so that the transition is seamless. So as I like to say, and I had the opportunity to run into Joe Manchin a few years ago and talk about that, and I told him I understood the reluctance of people in the coal community of West Virginia of having them transition or all of a sudden make this jump and this switch. But my thing is this, being a former worker in petrochemical and a union person, that if you're going to make the transition fair and equitable, you train people for the jobs that are to come and those opportunities. So that if Friday is the last day that you're going to spend on that job in coal, when you get up Monday morning and go to work, you're going into that clean, green, renewable job. There's no loss of income. There's no loss of benefits. Matter of fact, these are clean, green union jobs. So there's a seamless transition, and that takes planning and articulation, which can come from the grassroots and frontline communities. So that role has to be there. But also, as a whole of government approach, training agencies, colleges, universities, technical schools all have to be involved. And it has to be a planned action. It can't happen by accident or by hapstance. You have to plan those steps along the way and identify them and integrate the community into them, because you can't leave the community behind. And that's one of the concerns I have as they look at some of the initiatives that the Department of Energy and others are doing in Port Arthur, is to make sure that the community is ingrained in it. And this is a plan that comes from them, not one that's superimposed on them, so that they have a role in it because they know where the people are and who they are that need the training and need the work and need the opportunities. That hasn't happened with fossil fuels. You know, I didn't say this. Port Arthur has some of the highest unemployment in the state, yet there's over $80 billion in industrial petrochemical development in the area. How can that be? Because they're importing labor, which is forcing out the local labor force, the Port Arthur labor force. So in order to make sure you reduce that unemployment, you've got to be at the table, because there's that old saying, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. It's true. You're going to be sacrificed. And once again, as I said earlier, we refuse to be sacrificed any longer. We're going to be in it. We're going to hold our government and elected officials from the city level to county, state, all the way to federal responsible. And because the federal government is overseeing this, they're our big brother in the room. They're the ones there to see and enforce this, to make sure that it's done fairly and equitably, that we are included in the process so that we can tell them and make sure. This, and I'm going to turn it over back to you, Dominic. that we had a meeting while I've been gone. I've been gone since the 10th of last month, traveling all over the place, and I'm not going to tell you all the places I've been. Just been a lot, and cops the end of the road. But in going to these places, while they were there, the Department of Energy came in to do something with the community and all. And so I talked to my charges that work with my organization, our leadership, as well as advisory members, to be there and to be part of it, to be registered, and to just let them know where you stand and where you feel. Because sometimes elected officials and others paint a rosier picture than what it really is and what it appears to be. And we want to make sure that we're integrated into the process. So some of them brought some real harsh realities to not only the city council, but to the Department of Energy, which had them kind of, whoa, we didn't know this. But that's why you have to be at the table when this is done, to make sure that you're treated fairly, and then to make sure that they do their due diligence in making this work. Because if it doesn't work, imagine what that looks like for them. So we're here to help you. Help us help you, but include us at the hip in being part of this.
I think the last part of your questioning was focused on Ukraine's ability to phase out coal and the transition. Well, I do realize you have to head out.
Unfortunately, I have to go to
Thank
another
you.
event, but I appreciate being here with you. Dom, thanks once again. Thank you, panel, for being here.
Thank you so much, John.
The question, like, thank you very much. First of all, like, I had two takes on. First of all, about the ecocide, right? For me, it was pretty huge surprise. You know, how come the international community have come up with the acknowledgement of the ecocide before? But that's another point. It's just like from my perspective. But like, but again, like we have been like here at COP like me for 9 days already, and of course COPs do make change. They do bring so many important topics up. They do influence, but you know, acknowledgement of the fact, no, acknowledgement that ecocide should be considered, should be like the international crime is not enough. I mean, it's like, it's a matter of enforcement. It's a matter how later on it would be applied. You know, we can see it, like we can't bring like the countries that are provoking the wars to the table just like for doing it like in the war related things. And we're talking about ecocide. I mean, like, we're talking about the destruction of the environment. So like, it's not enough for us to acknowledge and to embed it into legislation. Like, I have been teaching law for too long to understand that law alone never works. So it's the matter of, I mean, like, we can draft any kind of laws, international, national, like subnational and like regional, but unless we have all of the members of society, all of the levels involved and interested in making this law happen, in make it real, law doesn't work. So the point is not about acknowledging this or that. It's not only about talking, but it's about raising awareness, educating. That's the first thing, to raise up consciousness. And this consciousness should start from the very early ages, you know, like of a child. I have been teaching a lot, and I have seen the shift of the formation of the Ukrainian consciousness, Ukrainian identity, climate consciousness, environmental consciousness. And this is incredibly important. We need to raise awareness. And with the raising of this awareness, we can involve all of the societal members into the participation of making any kind of laws, acknowledgements, frameworks really embedded and really having its real result. So we need people to know, to have the voice to speak up, and policymakers to be able to like listen to these people, listen to these voices, and then these people who have been raised properly, they should become the policymakers. So we need to raise the new generation of people who understand how important it is. And the time is now. Thank you.
Do you want to cover the partnership agenda?
Can you remind me? Yeah, this is the wonderful thing about what Globe is able to do is bring these different organizations and the networks of networks together. Because if we weren't part of Globe, we would not necessarily know that exists, right? And I'm sure that's the case for other members. And in a similar manner, it would interestingly with the IRA, the same thing. It's like the local electeds aren't aware of some of the benefits coming out of it. And so we have a task force with the that we've put together that represents every state at the local and a state level so that the information disseminates, and then partnered with the EOPA, partnered with the Department of Energy and others. So taking that analogy and bringing it into the pact here, it's wonderful to see, because actually if we could bring together like the Energy Security Marshall Plan and the other parts of it and find the best solutions coming out of every region, right? So as we were talking about earlier, that one of the innovative things about Ukraine is we have the ability to look around the world and see where the best case scenarios are of solutions for climate transitions, and doing it at an accelerated and rapid rate. Because we're frankly out of time for our planet, and Ukraine doesn't have the time right now even, right? So having the network of being able to say, okay, let's choose, this is a really wonderful project that we could bring in, and then share and learn from them. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, because then we can improve each of the individual networks and plans to ensure that we have to hit these goals to reduce the harmful effects, the worst effects of the climate crisis, so that it doesn't increase our insecurity worldwide. We already have 100 million people displaced worldwide, and that's only going to increase with climate disruption and dangers that are creating increasing conflicts, which is sad. So the solution is being able to coordinate with organizations, with EOPA Globe, find the best solutions and implement them rapidly but justly.
Wonderful, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? All right. Well, thank you so much again to Globe for the opportunity, and to Yevgenia, and to Alex, and to John for being our panelists. And we're excited to continue the conversation with you as we close out COP.